Althusser and the Ideological State Apparatuses. Foreword to Louis Althusser's On the Reproduction of Capitalism by Etienne Balibar. Jacques Bidet and the Presses Universitaires de France have invited me to contribute an additional introduction to the second edition of Althusser's posthumously published book Sur la Reproduction, which they first published in 1995. Since then, there has been steady demand for the book. I am touched and honored by their invitation, and am very happy that they have accepted, by way of a contribution to their enterprise, a text that is not absolutely new, because it was written some time ago and has already been published, albeit not in French. It is the preface that I wrote for Ariella Azoulay's Hebrew translation of the chapter from Althusser's text entitled On Ideology. I do not wish to modify it. The reason is that I was already trying to formulate the questions that I myself have about the construction and implications of an ensemble, the most striking part of which is, like it or not, the discussion of the ideological state apparatuses, even as I was doing my best to recall and reconstruct the circumstances of the text's composition and partial publication, for it so happens that I was rather closely associated with both. I also welcome the opportunity to associate our readings of Althusser with a colleague whose own work, which bears, in particular, on the mode of production of the visual arts, holds an important place in the field of contemporary theory, and whose fight for justice at the side of the Palestinian people, oppressed by the State of Israel, is in my view quite admirable. That certain of Althusser's works, produced in a very different context that is, by now, 40 years behind us, should seem to people here and in other places across the globe to be an intellectual, moral and political resource is, I think, a lovely lesson of history, truly. In the present brief preface, I do not want to make a detailed commentary on Althusser's text about ideological state apparatuses, ISAs, now translated into Hebrew for the first time. In response to a request from Ariella Azoulay, whom I very warmly thank for soliciting a contribution from me and then waiting patiently for it, I would simply like to offer a few remarks about the text's status and the conditions under which it was produced. I believe it can be said that this text has become, and will remain, one of its author's major works. It is one of those that serve as a reference point when it is a question of characterizing his thought, one mobilizing concept that bears his personal signature and is immediately recognizable as his. Here, ideological state apparatuses and ideological interpolation, elsewhere, the epistemological break, symptomatic reading, and so on. Finally, one that contemporary philosophy in the structuralist or post-structuralist line continues to work on. Yet its status, even when it is considered in the context of a fragmentary, unfinished and largely posthumous text, is altogether paradoxical. To begin with, which text are we talking about? Given the modalities of its release and re-release, it is impossible to assign it a unique identity today or to trace its boundaries with certainty. On the contrary, we have to recall its history and inscribe it in various, partially competing ensembles so as to understand how it is that the commentaries it has elicited, which today accompany it or prescribe the way it is read, can be so divergent. The text translated into Hebrew comprises Chapter 12, titled On Ideology, of the posthumous volume that Jacques Bidet edited and issued in 1995, 5 years after Althusser's death. This is a reasonable choice, since it gives the reader access to a version, both coherent and complete, of Althusser's autonomous discussion of, specifically, ideology. Yet it was not at all in this form that the text was initially released before being reprinted, translated into various languages, and read and discussed. The first edition, which initially appeared as a contribution to the journal La Pensée, 1970, and then as a chapter in the book Positions, Paris, edition Socialis, 1976, under the title Idéologie et appareils idéologiques d'État, notes pour une recherche, was both longer, inasmuch as it prefaced the theory of the mechanism of ideology with an argument about the reproduction of the conditions of production, and, at the same time, an abridged version of its own argument. It was presented as made up of 2 extracts from an ongoing study that were being submitted to others for discussion. Since the ongoing study was never finished and was not published in its author's lifetime, while the debate occasioned by the extracts was very lively and substantial in a number of different countries, it is safe to assume that most commentators will continue to refer to this historic version. I shall, therefore, say something about the circumstances and causes of this imbroglio. Jacques Bidet, in his critical and philological introduction, says that there exist two versions of the complete manuscript of de la Superstructure from which these extracts were taken. Both are unfinished. The first, approximately 150 pages long, was written in March to April 1969. The second, some 200 pages long, is undated. It revises and augments the first. The 1970 Ponce piece, made up of extracts from Chapter 3, The Reproduction of the Conditions of Production, Chapter 4, Base and Superstructure, Chapter 6, The State, Chapter 9, The Reproduction of the Relations of Production, and Chapter 12, On Ideology, lies, Bidet surmises, somewhere between the two versions, independently of the cuts, condensations and addenda that mark it. All this is incomprehensible if we do not explain what led Althusser to release such a partial montage rather than a text that was complete, but unfinished, and, in fact, unfinishable. To explain that, we have to go back to the way Althusser's illness, which the psychiatrists called a manic-depressive psychosis, was bound up with the political circumstances of the day. In May to June 1968, at the time of the events that Althusser himself described, after the fact, as an ideological revolt of the masses of young people in the school system, he found himself, doubtless not by accident, in a clinic in a Paris suburb, where he was undergoing treatment for a depressive episode. During the treatment, he was cut off from the world outside. In the months that followed, after taking the measure of the significant changes in the social situation and political atmosphere in France and abroad, and trying to interpret their meaning in the course of sometimes difficult discussions with a number of his friends and students, some of whom had taken a more or less active part in the movement, Althusser proposed to make a contribution of his own to a work then in progress by returning to questions of Marxist theory bearing on the relations between base and superstructure. A group to which I, too, belonged, along with Pierre Macherey, Roger Establet, Christian Bordelot, and Michel Tort, had, setting out from notes and public interventions from the preceding period, undertaken to produce a collective work. According to the plan, it was to be voluminous, on the theory of the school system in capitalist society, the capitalist mode of production. In particular, we had decided to use a terminology that included the notions of scholastic form, patterned after commodity form in the first part of Capital, and scholastic apparatus, patterned after state apparatus in Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte and his other political works. It was agreed that these two elaborations, ours and Althusser's, would be confronted. A common doctrine was supposed to emerge from the confrontation. It was our sense that we comprised something like an original school of thought within Western Marxism. The strikes and the mass social movements of 1968 and the following months had spread the idea on the Marxist left that we were entering a new revolutionary cycle that could bring on fundamental changes. When compared with the classical models, however, a certain number of differences leapt to the eye. They put orthodox Marxists such as Althusser, convinced of the primacy of class struggle and the politically organized workers' movement, in a ticklish situation. Not only were the 1968 struggles affecting the countries of the socialist camp and the capitalist camp alike, from China through Czechoslovakia, France, Germany and Italy to Poland, from the United States to Brazil, they also assigned or, at least, seemed to assign, a leading role to new social movements, including the student movement. Even secondary school students had mobilized, in relation with the overt crisis of major authoritarian institutions such as the schools and the family. From his first widely debated essays on, Althusser had attached great importance to developing the Marxist theory of ideology or even producing a theory from scratch, with a view to refounding or reconstructing historical materialism. This, to be sure, gave him the impression that he could account for the novelty of the political phenomena of his day. At the same time, however, it presented him, and us as well, with a challenge it was not easy to take up in an intellectual environment increasingly strained by the proliferating division into irreconcilable tendencies of political organizations all claiming to be Marxist, at a time when many critical theorists were increasingly taking their distance from references to Marx. None of these plans was to be realized as originally envisaged. Althusser, working in a state of great excitement, as he always did after a depressive phase, had in a few weeks produced a manuscript which, albeit incomplete, already took the form of a book. He sent it to the group working on the schools, which had set to work earlier than he had and independently of him, but was progressing more slowly, amid critical readings of Bourdieu, Durkheim, Freinet, and Krupskaya, as well as statistical tables on the primary and secondary school experiences of bourgeois and working-class children. The question at this point was how to make the suture between the analyses of the scholastic apparatus that we had arrived at, for our part, and the general idea, elaborated by Althusser, of ideological state apparatuses and their function in reproducing capitalist relations of production. Despite the similarity of our ideas and terminologies, we were unable to reach agreement. The result was general paralysis. It was exacerbated by political tensions which originated in the fact that some of us felt closer to Maoist groups, the Union des Jeunesses Communistes, Marxists, Leninists and, subsequently, the Gauche Proletarienne, whereas others, including Althusser himself, deemed it necessary to stay inside the party, that is, the official Communist Party. The autonomy of theory was falling to pieces. Althusser, for his part, soon fell ill again. This was perhaps not just a reaction to these tensions and, more generally, the ordeal to which he was subjected because of his attachment to the party, which charged him with being the master thinker behind the radical leftists, at a time when many of his close disciples had become dissidents and demanded that he join them, before going on to accuse him of revisionism and treason. It was also due to a general weakening of his physical state that had deep roots and only got worse as the years wore on. The upshot was that all the work all of us had done was broken off and never finished. Althusser's manuscript sur la reproduction ended up joining a series of other texts in various states of completion that he turned out between 1968 and 1980. These often took the form of treatises or popularized essays written on the model of the classical Marxist introductions to historical materialism. He worked on them when his illness was in remission and left them unfinished. Some have now been published in collections of his posthumous works. In 1970, however, when Althusser returned to active life, friends of his, notably Marcel Cornu, editor of the Revue La Pensée, invited him to share some of his work in progress with the public. It now seemed to Althusser that an elaboration of his views on ideology could spark another round in a discussion that, he hoped, would help him get back to work. This is what motivated the montage of extracts that he published under the title Ideologie et appareils idéologiques d'état, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. Destiny was to convert this stopgap solution into something with definitive or, at any rate, long-term status. For it was on the faith of impressions spawned by the conjunction of two fundamentally discontinuous series of arguments, one centered on the question of the reproduction of the relations of production, the other on the ideological mechanism of interpolation, recognition and guarantee, that the commentaries, utilizations and critiques were to be based. At the point of apparatic encounter between the two lay the notion, or Kabbalistic expression, I.S.A. In the original edition, by which I mean the 1970 piece, dotted lines were inserted between the extracts after they had been reworked. These lines, especially those separating two major developments, have taken on an unforeseen function. They materialize an absence, a void, to use a word highlighted by one of Althusser's best commentators and editors, François Matheron, who thus puts one of the philosopher's favorite expressions in play and en abîme, that is also the site of very important, very forbidding problems. I have always felt that the fecundity of Althusser's text has, precisely, to do with this suspension of the argument in the vicinity of the decisive articulation, signposted and simultaneously spirited away, which is materialized by the dotted line. Readers were led to look for the solution to the problem themselves, either because they imagined that Althusser himself was in possession of it but, for some mysterious reason, would not or could not reveal it, or because they had understood that he was not, in fact, in possession of it, and so tried to find a way to develop and transform each available sketch of a solution in hopes of coming up with one themselves. What they could not have known, obviously, and what publication of the manuscript in its entirety shows us today, is that which forms the missing link in Althusser's text. Essentially, it is a discussion of law and of revolution, separated by a suggestion to extend the classical Marxist concept of the state. In his discussion of law, Althusser sets out from theses that are basically quite close to those of the positive law tradition, and, underlying it, the Kantian definition of law and its difference from morality, in order to insist on the repressive nature of the law. His conclusion is that law is by itself incapable of guaranteeing the reproduction or stabilization of the dominant social relations, whence, he says, the functional necessity of an ideological supplement of effectivity. In his discussion of the state, he endeavors to explain, while sounding cautionary notes in profusion, how one can simultaneously think the perpetuation of the conditions of exploitation and the necessity of their interruption. This is the usual crux in Marxist attempts to articulate theory and practice. The most interesting aspect of Althusser's text is doubtless its reconsideration of his earlier discussion of the difference in the temporalities of the political struggle, a short temporality, that of the class struggles that unfold in the public sphere, with, as their stakes, possession of state power, and a long temporality, that of the class struggles which, riding roughshod over the border between public and private, unfold in the materiality of ideology. This sketch of a solution, however, merely highlights, by way of the embarrassment betrayed in the writing itself, the aporia that Althusser encounters, the ideological class struggle on which the effectivity of the political struggle itself depends, since it prepares the conditions for the political struggle and mobilizes its bearers. The revolutionary class cannot itself be the historical last instance of the political. Its own effectivity is referred back to the enigmatic short circuit of two heterogeneous materialities. It is the infrastructure that is determinant in the last instance. Thus the fact that contemporary readers now have access to Althusser's intervening arguments will by no means diminish their perplexity. On the other hand, it will paralyze their theoretical imaginations by replacing a glaring void with an apparent fullness. That is why, notwithstanding the depressing and even, in the end, tragic consequences to which it is due, I consider it an extraordinary objective fluke that Althusser was forced to publish his essay in the form, not of a pseudo-treatise on historical materialism, but, rather, as a collage of two heterogeneous propositions open to the unknown. It remains to ask, before leaving the readers to confront Althusser's words on their own, how we are to think the effects of that heterogeneity today. It seems to me that one can advance two hypotheses here. First, history, political, social, intellectual, has completely shattered the unity, even the problematic unity, of the two discourses that Althusser's structural Marxism sought to combine in such a way that each would help sustain the other. It has relegated them to contexts that hardly communicate now. This is not to say that history thereby flags the absurdity of the attempt, for that attempt has a great deal to teach us about the theoretical demands of its day, and testifies to a remarkable seriousness, or sense of responsibility for the consequences of one's discourse, whose lesson has not been lost. Second, the divorce between the contexts in question testifies, in its fashion, to the omnipresence of a multiform question, that of the subject and, indissolubly bound up with it, that of political subjectivation, which, clearly, always has its place within several different intellectual horizons at the same time. Althusser's discussions of the reproduction of the relations of production are based on a concept of structure which, it has been said, is essentially functionalist. He had constantly to defend himself against that charge. But it is a question, rather, of inscribing the possibility or even necessity of a break with the dominant capitalist system at the precise point of this system's constitutional fragility, that is, in a sense, its point of contingency, as Althusser would later put it. The Althusserian reading of Marx's text suggests that we should identify this point with an extended conception of social reproduction. In these discussions, which all remain more or less unfinished and are all heavily marked by the traditional terminology of historical materialism, Althusser accordingly endeavors strategically to bring to bear on this one point all the elements of the structure's retroactive action on itself, in order to make them the privileged sites and objects of the class struggle. We might say that his inspiration is ultra-Leninist, in the sense that he does not content himself with defining the objective of the organized class struggle as state power and the state apparatus, but redoubles the latter notion in such a way as to be able to include in it both ideological domination and the latent centralization of ideological practices and representations on the basis of a state ideology, which, in the bourgeois epoch, is probably legal ideology in his view. Thus it is as if Althusser were trying to reinforce and accentuate the totalitarian image of bourgeois domination and the obscure power of the state, in order ultimately to arrive, by an oxymoron, at the possibility of overthrowing it. The strongest link is also, potentially, the weakest. This also grounds his disagreement with Gramsci. It is crystallized in Althusser's rejection of the Gramscian notion of hegemony and in his insistence on the exteriority of the revolutionary party, or movement, to the whole system of bourgeois superstructures, the correlative of its interiority or critical immanence to the practices of the popular masses and the working class. But this merely displaces the problem. And the idea of an organization external to ideological forms of organization, which are obviously apparatus forms in their turn, is, it will be agreed, quite enigmatic. The other aspect of Althusser's work on ideology in fact belongs to a completely different context. The idea that ideology has a structure in general is not only not traceable to the Marxist tradition, even if Althusser demonstrates its kinship with certain remarks by Marx, particularly in the German ideology. Ideology has no history of its own, which he read symptomatically. This simply proves that Marx and Marxism are not the same thing, that idea in fact refers us to a different concept of structure. In question here, as far as Althusser's own work is concerned, is a series of texts stretching from the 1964 essay Freud and Lacan, republished in Positions in 1976, through, notably, two essays collected in For Marx, The Piccolo Teatro, Bertolazzi and Brecht, 1962, and Marxism and Humanism, 1963, to the 1976 or 1977 text on Marx and Freud, published in the Proceedings of the Psychoanalytic Congress of Tbilisi. In these writings, Althusser pursues a study of the imaginary constitution of the subject as the fundamental ideological effect, or, better, as an effect of the structure of ideology. Obviously, however, there is an element of circularity here, for the effect of the structure of ideology par excellence is, precisely, to constitute subjects to which we may add that, if the essential goal of the structuralist movement, in which Althusser participated in his way, was to conceptualize the constitution of the subject in place of the constitutive subject of the classic transcendental philosophies, ideology here becomes simply another name for structure. Althusser develops his study, as appears, in particular, at the moment of the transition from the first to the second and third moments of the constitution of the subject, hailing, recognition, guarantee, by working on theoretical models borrowed from Hegel, Freud, Feuerbach and Spinoza, under the general aegis of Spinoza, credited with having inaugurated a critical philosophy of the imaginary and its social effectivity. It is certainly not a complete theory, but does it make any sense to demand that a theory be complete? One of the keys to its interpretation, which one may consider extrinsic, but which does also point to the circulation of problems and concepts in the conjuncture of the period, resides, manifestly, in a latent controversy with Lacan, a controversy about which students today are often curious, around the question of the symbolic. Althusser basically takes the signifiers of the symbolic from the discourse of monotheism, especially with his two references to its Mosaic refoundation, I am your servant Moses, and its repetition/transformation in the New Testament, thou art Peter. In this connection, we may say that Althusser very unceremoniously pulls the Lacanian symbolic back into the field of the imaginary and the speculary relation characteristic of it, in order to make it a function internal to the imaginary. By the same token, obviously, he implicitly asks how we should think the real, which, in the well-known Lacanian scheme, forms the third pillar of the explanation of the unconscious. All indications would seem to be that Althusser refuses to identify the real, as Lacan does, with the negative function of an impossible or a traumatic event that is unrepresentable because it cannot be symbolized, in short, a transcendental thing in itself. What, then, constitutes the positivity of the real, the correlate of the materiality of the imaginary? The suggestion is made on the text's horizon, but, here too, in very enigmatic fashion, that this question can probably not be divorced from the question of the bad subject, the one who does not manage to go all by herself or who resists interpellation. We might also say that it is a question of the subject's excessive power, the result of her very weakness, with respect to the circuit of interpellation, which, nevertheless, constitutes her or confers her form on her. Yet one notes, this has often been noted, something of a strange reservation on Althusser's part here. It has, moreover, often been interpreted as a form of resistance or denial. I cannot, obviously, pursue an introduction and a discussion that would, if taken any further, sow the illusion of accomplished knowledge. I prefer to leave the reader with questions. It will be understood that they were not really posed for the first time today. However, when I look back on this presentation of the materiality characteristic of Althusser's writing, which I have just attempted to make at Ariela's invitation, I see that I have voluntarily or involuntarily suggested, after all, that the two divorced halves whose combination I have described have the same vanishing point. Let us call it the question of practice, a possible common name for the idea of an organization without organization that would make the revolution conceivable, and also for the idea of a counter-interpolation of the subject capable of manifesting, in the very forms of the imaginary, the externality, or positivity, with which it finds itself in a constitutive relationship unawares. To be honest, this suggestion smacks of the impenitent May 68er I have certainly continued to be, and, as it does no more than name something, it resolves nothing. One can only wish that contemporary readers of Althusser's text, in one or another of its configurations, will find other keys capable of investing it with meaning,